The drip was already moving. Steady. Quiet. The way death moves when it doesn't want to be noticed. 11:47 p.m. Mercy Ridge Private Medical Facility. 4th floor. A room that didn't exist on any official hospital log. And inside it, Cheon Teo, the man who controlled 3 ports, 2 politicians, and every gram of product moving through the eastern seaboard's underground. The man rival syndicates mentioned in whispers, if they mentioned him at all. 6 armed guards outside his door, a private surgeon who'd been paid enough to forget everything he'd seen tonight. Untouchable. Feared. Dominant. Except right now, he was unconscious, stitched up, sedated, and completely at the mercy of whatever was feeding into his arm through a clear plastic line. Nobody in that corridor knew the line had been tampered with. Nobody except her. Leora Gaines had been on shift for 9 hours. She hadn't asked for room 412. She hadn't asked for any of this. She was a 3rd shift nurse in worn-down scrubs, running on 2 hours of sleep and the kind of quiet exhaustion that makes the body move on muscle memory alone. Low status. Invisible. Exactly the kind of woman powerful men look through. But Leora saw things. She always had. She stepped into the room for a routine check. Vitals, IV bag, chart, standard, 30 seconds, maybe less. She initialed the clipboard, glanced at the line, and stopped. The secondary port, the small access point built into the IV tubing for adding medication directly into the drip. The seal was cracked. She hadn't touched it. She leaned closer, tilted the line toward the light above the bed. There, barely visible. A faint discoloration in the fluid inside the tube, not saline, not the post-surgical analgesic listed on the chart. Something else. Something thin, almost translucent, moving in the current of his drip. Moving toward him. Her mind ran the calculation in under 3 seconds. This wasn't a medical error. This was deliberate, and whatever had been introduced into that line, it was already circulating. She looked at the door. 6 armed men on the other side, who didn't know her name, and didn't care to. She looked at the monitor, his heart rate steady for now. She looked at the man in the bed, the most powerful criminal on the eastern seaboard, unconscious, helpless, dying by the drip. The room was completely silent. Nobody was coming. Nobody knew. Nobody. Except her. She is the only thing standing between this man and a death nobody will ever investigate, if she walks out of that room right now. He doesn't survive the night. Would you have stayed? Drop it in the comments. Because what she does next is something most people would never have the nerve to do. She grabbed the line with both hands and ripped it out. Clean, violent, decisive. Blood beaded instantly where the cannula tore free from his arm. The IV stand swayed. The disconnected tube swung loose, dripping discolored fluid onto the sterile floor, and the monitor alarm didn't hesitate. It screamed. Cheon Teo's eyes opened like a circuit completing. No gradual waking, no confusion. Pure, immediate threat response. The kind of reflex that doesn't care about surgical pain or sedation, only danger. The door exploded inward before the alarm finished its first cycle. 2 men, weapons half drawn, eyes locked on Leora like she was the threat. She held the disconnected line up. Steady, direct. No hesitation. That line was poisoned. Whatever was introduced into this drip was already circulating. If I hadn't pulled it, he would be dead inside 20 minutes. The word poisoned didn't land softly. It detonated. But here's what nobody in that room expected. Cheon Teo didn't look at his guards. He looked at her. Straight. Calculating. The sedative still burning off behind his eyes, his jaw locked against the pain of ripped stitches and adrenaline, and the dawning understanding that he'd come within minutes of dying in a room full of men who were supposed to protect him. His voice, when it came, was quiet. That was worse than if he'd shouted. Who was in this room? 4 words. In Korean. Barely above a whisper. And both guards went completely still. Because that silence, that pause between his question and their non-answer, was its own kind of confession. Nobody got past Cheon's men without clearance. Nobody accessed that room without someone on the inside knowing, which meant the threat wasn't outside. It was already in. Leora watched his face as that realization moved through him, watched the calculation, watched the rage compress itself into something colder and more dangerous than rage ever is. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. When Sora, Cheon's intelligence operative, pulled in through the side entrance, ran the toxicology sample from the disconnected line 20 minutes later, the result confirmed what Leora had already known from the moment she saw the discoloration. The compound in that line was not available through any hospital supply chain. It was black market, precise, untraceable without the right knowledge. Whoever did this, Sora said quietly, setting the result on the table, knew exactly what they were doing, and they knew exactly which port to use. Cheon said nothing. He was already looking at Leora. Not with gratitude. Not yet. With the look of a man who understood that the woman who just saved his life knew far more than a third-shift nurse had any reason to know. The attacker was inside his circle. The poison was confirmed. And the only person in that room he hadn't yet accounted for was her. The tension doesn't drop from here. It doubles. Because Cheon Tayo just realized two things simultaneously. Someone inside his organization tried to kill him, and the woman who stopped it is not who she claims to be. Stay with this story. It's about to go somewhere most people never see coming. Nobody moved. That was the thing. 6 armed men trained to react to any threat in under 2 seconds. And not one of them moved. Because Cheon Tayo's question was still hanging in the air. Who was in this room? And the silence answering it was louder than anything a gun could produce. Cheon didn't repeat himself. Men like him never did. He sat up against the pane, stitches pulling, jaw locked, and looked at each face in that room the way a judge looks at a verdict he already knows is wrong. One by one, slow, his second guard, a man named Gino, broke eye contact first. That was the tell. Cheon registered it, filed it, said nothing. But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Before anyone could speak, the lights died. Not a flicker, a full, decisive blackout. The kind that doesn't happen by accident in a private medical facility running on independent generators. 4 seconds of total darkness. Then the backup power kicked in and bathed the entire 4th floor in red emergency light. And from down the corridor, 3 sounds, back to back, shouting. A crash. Then the compressed, unmistakable pop of a suppressed weapon. The Beck Syndicate strike team was already inside the building. This was the moment that would later be known as the second wave. And nobody in that room had seen it coming. Cheon's men fractured immediately, 2 to the door, 1 to the window. Gino reached for his radio and couldn't get a signal. The room became noise and motion, and the specific kind of controlled panic that trained men get when the plan they prepared for stops matching the situation in front of them. Cheon tried to stand. Leora stopped him with one hand flat against his chest. You move, that incision tears open and I cannot help you. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. He sat back down. At this point, you're probably thinking, why would the most feared man on the eastern seaboard take an order from a nurse he met 11 minutes ago? Because Cheon Tayo was many things. But he was not stupid. She had already been right once tonight. The corridor outside was now a war zone. The strike team, 4 men, hospital scrubs, falsified credentials, had cut the power and were moving floor to floor. The IV poison had been phase 1. This was phase 2. They didn't just want Cheon slowed down. They wanted him confirmed dead. And the only person in that room thinking clearly enough to stop that from happening was the one person nobody had bothered to look at twice. She wasn't done saving his life yet. Stairwell B, Cheon said. Not a question. A calculation delivered as a statement. His men knew the extraction protocol. Black SUV at the rear loading dock. 2 minutes from ignition to clear. Problem was the 3 flights between them and the ground floor. Can you walk? Leora asked. A pause that cost him something real. I will walk. She didn't congratulate him on that. She was already moving. Pulling a sealed IV bag from the crash cart, rigging a portable gravity drip, checking the line twice before connecting it. She'd been doing this for 9 years. Her hands didn't shake. However, what she did next surprised everyone in that room. She looped his arm over her shoulder. Not a guard. Not one of his men. Her. Cheon said nothing, but something shifted in the set of his jaw. The specific expression of a man recalibrating a situation he thought he already understood. They moved. One guard on point. One covering the rear. Cheon's weight against Leora's shoulder. Substantial. Deliberate. Every step a negotiation between his body and his will. The red emergency lighting painted the stairwell in long shadows. Above them, 2 floors up, the sounds of the strike team moving got closer. Too close. "Who poisoned the line?" Leora asked as they hit the second landing. "You already know. You've known since Gino broke eye contact." Cheon looked at her sharply. She'd seen that too. "My second," he said after a moment. Quiet. "Final. Do-1. 15 years. I built this organization with him." "How certain?" Only he knew which room, which port, which shift. She absorbed that without slowing her pace. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it. Not for the crime boss, but for the human being processing the specific devastation of realizing the person standing closest to you has been measuring the distance to your throat for God knows how long. She knew that feeling. She knew it personally. But she didn't say that. Not yet. "You are not afraid," Cheon said. It came out less like an observation and more like a question he didn't know how to ask. "I'm terrified," Leora said. "I'm just better at terrified than most people." They hit the ground floor as the big team hit the third. 30 seconds between them and disaster. The black SUV was already at the loading dock. Engine running, doors open, Cheon's remaining men materializing from the shadows of the service corridor. Leora brought him to the vehicle door. He stopped, turned, and said the one word she hadn't prepared for. "Come." She had a choice to make in the next 5 seconds, and what she decided changed everything that followed. The safe house was quiet. Too quiet for a man who'd just survived 2 attempts on his life in one night. Cheon sat on the edge of a cot, jaw tight, watching Leora work. She'd already changed his dressing, started a clean IV, and documented his vitals on a notepad she'd pulled from her scrub pocket. All without being asked. All without hesitation. That bothered him more than the pain. People who moved that efficiently in chaos weren't reacting. They were executing. And there was a difference. One Cheon Taiyou understood better than most. "You've done this before," he said. "Not a question." "I'm a nurse," she said flatly. "This is what I do." "Not this," he said. "All of it. The stairwell. The extraction. Reading the room before any of my trained men did." She didn't answer right away. And that pause, that single, loaded pause, told Cheon everything. He leaned forward despite the pain. "Who are you, Leora Gaines?" She capped the medical marker, set it down carefully. Then she looked at him with the kind of steadiness that doesn't come from confidence. It comes from having already decided, long before this moment, exactly how far she was willing to go. "Someone who needed you alive," she said, "for reasons that have nothing to do with medicine." The room went absolutely still. That was the moment. The one that would later split this entire story into before and after. Because Cheon Taiyou had been lied to by professionals his entire career. Politicians, lawyers, men he'd trusted with his life. But he had never, not once, heard a truth land quite like that. And the worst part? He still didn't know what it meant. She just told a Korean Mafia boss, to his face, that she had a personal reason for keeping him alive, and he didn't throw her out. Think about that. Drop a comment right now. Do you think she's playing him, or is she the only real one in that room? Because the answer changes everything about what happens next. Cheon didn't sleep that night. He had Sora pull Leora's full background before dawn. Not the surface file, the deep one. Employment records, family history, every address she'd lived at in the last 15 years. What Sora brought back stopped him cold. 11 years ago, a woman named Celestine Gaines, Leora's older sister, had been the lead witness in a federal racketeering case tied directly to a Korean organized crime network operating out of Baltimore. Celestine had documented everything: payments, meetings, shell accounts. 18 months of evidence assembled with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was building and exactly what it would cost her. She never made it to the stand. Her death was ruled accidental. The case collapsed without her testimony. And the man who benefited most from her silence, the man whose name appeared at the center of every transaction Celestine had ever documented, was Do-won Park, Cheon's former second-in-command, the man who'd poisoned his IV line 12 hours ago. Sora set the file on the table without a word. Cheon read it twice. Then he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. At this point, you're probably thinking, this was just a coincidence. Wrong hospital, wrong shift, wrong room. But there are no coincidences in a story like this. Leora Gaines had requested a transfer to Mercy Ridge 9 months ago. She had specifically requested the 4th floor rotation. She had been waiting, methodically, patiently, for the moment Do-won's world and Cheon's world would collide inside that building. She hadn't saved Cheon out of instinct. She had saved him out of strategy. However, what Cheon didn't know yet was that her strategy had a cost she hadn't told him about, and that cost was about to walk through the door. Cheon called Leora into the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply placed Sora's file on the table between them, opened to the page with Celestine's name, and waited. Leora looked at it. Then she looked at him, and she didn't deny a single word. "You came for Do-won," Cheon said. "Yes." "You knew he was my second." "Yes." "And you arranged to be in that hospital because you knew the ambush was coming." She didn't flinch. "I knew someone inside your organization was feeding intel to the Beck Syndicate. I didn't know the target. I only knew it would happen at Mercy Ridge, because that's where your organization routes emergency care. My sister spent 18 months documenting that before they killed her." The silence after that sentence was the heaviest silence in the room all night. Cheon studied her face the way he studied everything, looking for the crack, the tell, the place where the performance broke down. There was none. "You saved my life to get to him," he said. "Yes, but the poison in that line would have killed anyone. I pulled it because it was wrong, not only because it was you." "That's not a full answer." "No," she said quietly, "it's not." But that wasn't even the most shocking part. Because right then, before Cheon could respond, Sora walked back in with a second file, thinner, newer, pulled from a federal database contact she'd burned a 3-year favor to access. She set it down without expression. Do-won hadn't just run. He'd already made a move. And that move had Leora's name written all over it. The file told a story nobody in that room was ready for. Do-won Park had contacted a federal task force, the same team that had been building a RICO case against Cheon's organization for 3 years. He wasn't running from the law. He was using it. He'd offered to turn state's evidence, not against himself, against Cheon. And as his opening gesture of good faith, he had handed them one name: Leora Gaines, a black nurse with a documented personal vendetta, currently residing inside a known organized crime safe house, with no record of coercion and no official report filed at the hospital she'd fled. On paper, she didn't look like a woman who had saved a life. She looked exactly like a mob asset who'd been placed inside that hospital on purpose. Do-won hadn't just poisoned an IV line, he had built a second trap. Cleaner, slower, and far more dangerous than the first. One that used the federal government as the weapon. At this point, you're probably thinking, surely Cheon would protect her. He owed her his life. But protection inside a Mafia organization isn't simple. Every move Cheon made on her behalf now created a paper trail. Every resource he spent tracking Do-won was a resource that could be logged, flagged, and handed to a federal prosecutor who was already looking for exactly this kind of evidence. Do-won had learned from the best. He'd learned from Cheon himself. The room stayed quiet for a long time after Sora finished speaking. Then Leora set down the file, straightened, and said the one thing nobody expected. Then we move first. Tonight. This was the moment the entire plan changed. And not everyone in that room was going to survive what came next. Moving first meant walking into the lion's den. Leora's plan was simple on the surface and dangerous underneath. She would reach out to Do-won directly, offer a meeting, let him believe the alliance between her and Cheon had fractured, that she was now operating alone, scared, and willing to deal. Cheon listened to the entire plan without interrupting. Then he said, "He won't believe you came alone." "He will," Leora said, "because he already thinks I'm an asset you're using. He doesn't know what I gave you. He thinks I'm expendable. And expendable people get desperate. Desperate people make contact." Cheon studied her. "You'd walk into a room with the man who had your sister killed. I've been walking toward that room for 11 years. There was nothing left to argue. Cheon made 2 calls. The meeting was set at a private dining room inside a restaurant Do-won controlled on the waterfront. Neutral enough to seem safe, controlled enough to feel like a trap. Except Do-won thought he was setting it. He wasn't. Leora walked in alone. No wire, no weapon. Just 11 years of patience and a USB drive already in transit to a federal prosecutor in the Southern District of New York. Sent 40 minutes before she sat down. Do-won Pak was smaller than she'd imagined. Composed. Polite. The kind of dangerous that wears a gray suit and offers you sparkling water before it destroys you. "Leora Gaines," he said. "I wondered when you'd surface. You paid Judge Reinhold $42,000 to bury my sister's case," she said. "Every transaction, every meeting, every account. It's already gone." The composure cracked. Just slightly. But enough. And that crack, that single fracture in Do-won Pak's carefully constructed face was the moment Leora Gaines had been waiting 11 years to see. However, what happened in the next 60 seconds made everything before it look like a warm-up. She walked into that room alone. No backup, no weapon. Just truth and 11 years of waiting. If this story has you locked in, you already know this channel doesn't play games. Hit subscribe right now. Because what Do-won does when that composure fully breaks is something you cannot afford to miss. And the people who aren't subscribed won't see it coming. The door opened. Cheon Tayo walked in. Do-won's eyes moved between them. The boss he'd tried to poison, and the nurse he'd tried to frame. And in that single moment, the full architecture of what had been built against him became clear. He'd miscalculated. Not once. Twice. He'd underestimated Leora when she was just a nurse. Then he'd underestimated her again when he thought she was just a pawn. Both mistakes had led him here. To a table he thought he'd set, inside a trap he thought he'd built, facing 2 people he'd written off as manageable. Do-won was many things, but he wasn't a man who fell apart in public. "This changes nothing," he said quietly. "The federal case is already open. Whatever you've sent. It takes time. I still have leverage." "You had leverage," Cheon said, "before tonight." What followed wasn't loud. There were no raised voices, no dramatic threats. Just the specific, suffocating silence of a man realizing that every exit he'd built for himself had already been closed. Not by force, but by 2 people who had trusted each other just enough to outthink him. But that wasn't even the most important thing that happened in that room. The most important thing was what Cheon did after Do-won was taken out by his remaining men. He turned to Leora, and for the first time since the hospital, since the IV line, the stairwell, the safe house, all of it, he didn't look at her like a variable he was still calculating. He looked at her like someone who had earned something real. "Whatever you need," he said simply, "it's done." She nodded once. No celebration, no relief. Because both of them knew. Do-won being cornered wasn't the end. It was the moment the real danger began. Cornering Do-won was supposed to be the hardest part. It wasn't. The hardest part came 40 minutes later, when Sora's phone lit up with an intercept from a federal field office in Baltimore. A communication that had gone out 6 hours before the restaurant meeting even happened. Do-won had anticipated them. Not the meeting specifically, but the direction, pressure. He'd read the board 3 moves ahead and made a counter move so precise it was almost beautiful, the kind of move a man makes when he knows the walls are closing and decides to become the wall himself. He hadn't just offered the federal task force Leora's name. He'd given them something else. A location, a timestamp. Security footage from a parking structure 2 blocks from the safe house, showing Xi'an's vehicle on the night of the hospital extraction. That footage placed Xi'an outside a known federal surveillance zone at exactly the wrong time. And it placed Leora in the vehicle beside him. At this point, you're probably thinking the damage was already done, that the footage alone was enough to collapse everything they'd built. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the source Do-won had used to pull that footage. It wasn't a street camera. It wasn't a traffic system. It was an internal feed, the kind only accessible through law enforcement channels or someone embedded deep enough inside Cheon's own network to know exactly which routes his vehicles used. Sora read the intercept twice. Then she looked up. "There's still someone inside," she said. "Someone we haven't found." The room went cold. Because if that was true, everything they'd done since the hospital, every move, every conversation, every plan, had already been watched. Xi'an shut it down immediately. Every communication line, every contact, every scheduled exchange that wasn't already in motion. He pulled his remaining men into one room and told them 3 things: what he knew, what he suspected, and what happened to people who betrayed him twice. Nobody in that room moved. Nobody spoke. That silence was its own kind of answer. And Xi'an filed it. He turned to Leora. "How long before the federal prosecutor acts on what you sent?" 48 hours, she said. "Maybe less if the package lands the way it should. And if Do-won's contact inside the task force buries it first?" She didn't hesitate. "Then we lose the legal angle completely. Everything Celestine built, every transaction she documented, gone. Buried inside federal procedure for years." This was the gamble that would later define everything. 48 hours standing between 11 years of work and the kind of institutional silence that swallows evidence whole and never gives it back. Xi'an stood up, moved to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Then he said, "I have the prosecutor who buried your sister's original case, and I have documentation of every payment she received to do it." Leora went completely still. "You've had that this whole time?" "I acquired it 6 months ago. I didn't know what it connected to until Sora found the link." She stared at him. "And if you're thinking that revelation changed the temperature of the entire room, you'd be right. Because now they didn't just have Celestine's evidence. They had proof that the case had been deliberately destroyed. 2 weapons. 48 hours. 1 mole still breathing somewhere inside the operation. And no room left for a single mistake. They found the mole in the worst possible way. Not through surveillance, not through Sora's intercepts, not through anything as clean or controlled as investigation. They found him because he acted first. Gino, the guard who'd broken eye contact in room 412 the night everything started, had been inside Do-won's pocket for 14 months. Not for money, for protection. His younger brother had debts attached to the Beck Syndicate, and Do-won had offered a simple exchange. Information for immunity. 14 months of feeding locations. Routes. Safe house rotations. Every move Xi'an's organization had made since the hospital. Gino had already reported it. But that wasn't even the part that sealed his fate. The part that sealed it was what he did with 36 hours left on their window. He took Sora. Not loudly. Not violently. He simply offered to drive her to a secondary location for a equipment pickup. A routine run, nothing unusual. And 2 miles from the safe house, he stopped the car. Sora survived. Barely. She made it back on foot, one hand pressed to a cut above her eye, and delivered her report without sitting down. Because sitting down would have meant admitting how close it had been. Xi'an listened to every word without expression. Then he looked at the space where Gino had been standing an hour ago. He knew the 48-hour window, Leora said. He knew about the prosecutor. He knew about the footage counter. All of it. Yes, Cheon said. So Do-won knows we're out of time. Yes. She straightened. Then we don't wait for the window. We close it ourselves. Tonight. This was the decision that sealed every outcome that followed. And not all of those outcomes looked like victory. There was no second meeting request. No negotiation. No back channel. Leora simply walked into the federal field office in Baltimore at 9 p.m. and asked to speak with the lead prosecutor on the Cheon Tayo RICO case. The receptionist told her to take a seat. She sat for 4 minutes. Then a woman in a dark blazer appeared in the doorway. Prosecutor Ren Hadley. And the expression on her face told Leora everything she needed to know. Hadley already knew who she was. Do-won had made sure of that. But what Do-won hadn't accounted for, what he had never once considered in all his careful, precise planning, was that Leora hadn't come to defend herself. She'd come to deliver. She placed 3 items on the table in the interview room. The USB drive containing Celestine's full 18 months of documented evidence, a second drive containing Cheon's documentation of every payment made to Judge Reinhold to bury the original case, and a printed intercept pulled by Sora from the federal database contact, showing Do-won's direct communication with a task force insider, time-stamped 6 hours before the restaurant meeting. Hadley looked at all 3 items without touching them. You understand, she said carefully, that bringing this here doesn't automatically protect you. I'm not here for protection, Leora said. I'm here because my sister spent 18 months of her life building something that was stolen from her, and the person who stole it has been using federal infrastructure to keep it buried. Hadley picked up the first drive. That was the moment. The one that would later be recognized as the turning point of the entire case, when 11 years of silence finally broke in the right direction. But here's what nobody outside that room knew. While Leora sat across from Hadley, Cheon's remaining men had already moved on Do-won's last known location. Not to eliminate him, to deliver him. Physically, with documentation attached, to a separate federal contact Cheon had cultivated for exactly this kind of moment. 2 simultaneous moves, one legal, one not quite, both aimed at the same target. Do-won Pak was taken into federal custody at 9:14 p.m. He didn't resist, because by then, every exit had already been closed. Not with force, but with patience, strategy, and the kind of precision that only comes from someone who had spent 11 years preparing for exactly this night. And the person who had engineered every single second of it wasn't in the room when it ended. She was already gone. By morning, the 4th floor of Mercy Ridge Private Medical Facility was a federal crime scene. 2 members of the Beck strike team were in custody. The 4th floor was cordoned off. A nurse named Leora Gaines was listed in the incident report as missing. Her car still in the parking structure, her locker untouched, her name attached to a case nobody in that building fully understood yet. What the official report didn't mention. Do-won Pak was processed and charged on 4 federal counts before sunrise. Judge Reinhold resigned by 8 a.m. quietly, with no public statement, the way people resign when the alternative is worse. The RICO case against Cheon Tayo was reviewed, stripped of its primary witness, and closed within 72 hours. Insufficient evidence, compromised sourcing, a prosecutorial record that no longer held weight. And Celestine Gaines's documentation, 18 months of work that had cost her everything, was formally entered into the federal record. 11 years late, but entered. At this point, you're probably expecting the story to end with a celebration, a moment of relief, something that feels like a clean finish. Instead, Leora sat alone in a parking structure 3 blocks from the courthouse and let the silence do what silence does after something enormous finally stops moving. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just sat with it. With Celestine, with the 11 years, with all of it, and let herself feel the specific weight of a thing finally being done. Her phone buzzed once. An unsaved number, 2 words. It's done. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she typed back 2 words of her own. I know. She started the car. She drove. And somewhere behind her, In a world built on power, fear, and the assumption that invisible people stay invisible, a woman nobody had ever bothered to look at twice had just rewritten every rule of that world. Not with a weapon, not with money, with patience, with truth, with the kind of nerve most people talk about but never actually find. Leora walked into that story as a third-shift nurse nobody looked at twice. And she walked out having dismantled a man who thought he was untouchable, freed her sister's truth, and made one of the most feared men alive say thank you. If this story hit something real in you, you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe right now, because the next story makes this one look like the opening act, and the people who aren't here for it will hear about it from the ones who were.